Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Gettier problems. For over 2,000 years, philosophers believed they had a satisfactory definition of knowledge, tracing back to Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, and this definition stated that knowledge is justified true belief, that to know a proposition, three conditions must be met. The proposition must be true, the believer must believe it, and the believer must have good reasons or justification for believing it. And this tripartite analysis seem to capture what knowledge is, to distinguish genuine knowledge from lucky guesses, false beliefs, and unjustified opinions. And the definition was widely accepted, taught in textbooks, treated as settled wisdom, until 1963, when a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that shattered this consensus and transformed epistemology. Gettier presented cases now known as Gettier problems or Gettier cases, where all three conditions for knowledge are satisfied, and yet intuitively the person does not have knowledge, where justified true belief is present but knowledge is absent. And these cases show that the traditional definition is insufficient, that something more is needed, though what that something is remains a matter of intense debate. The structure of a Gettier case typically involves a person who has a justified belief that happens to be true, but is true for reasons unrelated to the justification, where the justification is somehow defective or based on a falsehood, yet the belief turns out to be true by luck or coincidence. And this combination of justification and truth without the right kind of connection between them produces cases where we hesitate to attribute knowledge. Consider one of Gettier's original examples. Smith and Jones have applied for a job, and Smith has strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The president of the company told him so, and Smith also knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith counted them, and from these two pieces of evidence, Smith infers that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and this inference is justified. It follows logically from what Smith believes he knows. But unbeknownst to Smith, it is actually Smith himself who will get the job. The president was mistaken or changed his mind. And by an extraordinary coincidence, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. And so Smith's belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket is true. And it is justified based on apparently good evidence. And yet Smith does not know this truth, because his belief is true for the wrong reasons. True because of a coincidence, rather than because of the facts that justified it. Another classic example involves a person looking at a clock. The clock reads 3 o'clock, and the person forms the belief that it is 3 o'clock. And this belief is justified because clocks are generally reliable sources of time information. But unbeknownst to the person, the clock stopped exactly 12 hours ago and just happens to be showing the correct time again. And so the belief is justified and true, but does not constitute knowledge because the truth is accidental, unconnected to the reason for belief. Gettier cases have proliferated. Philosophers have constructed hundreds of variations, each designed to test different theories of knowledge, each revealing new wrinkles in the concept, and the common thread is that the justification and the truth come apart. The belief is true, but not because of the justification, or the justification is based on a falsehood that happens to lead to a true conclusion, or the truth obtains for reasons the believer is unaware of. And in all these cases we feel that something is missing, that the person has justified true belief but lacks knowledge. The philosophical response to Gettier has been to add a fourth condition to the definition of knowledge, to supplement justified true belief with some additional requirement that rules out Gettier cases, and many such conditions have been proposed. Some argue for a no false lemmas condition, requiring that the justification not depend on any false beliefs, so that in the job case, Smith's reasoning depended on the false belief that Jones would get the job, and this false lemma disqualifies the belief from being knowledge even though the conclusion is true. But this condition faces problems, because not all Gettier cases involve false lemmas. Some involve true beliefs that are justified by faulty processes or that happen to be true by luck without depending on any particular false intermediate belief. Others propose causal theories of knowledge, requiring that the belief be caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true, that there be a causal connection between the truth and the belief. And this would rule out the clock case, because the fact that it is 3 o'clock is not causally responsible for the clock showing 3 o'clock. The clock shows that time because it stopped 12 hours ago, not because it is currently 3 o'clock. But causal theories struggle with cases involving abstract objects or mathematical truths, where causal connections seem inappropriate or impossible. Reliabilist theories propose that knowledge requires belief to be produced by a reliable process, a process that generally produces true beliefs. And this seems to handle many Gettier cases, because the processes involved, like inferring from false beliefs or reading stopped clocks, are not reliable even if they happen to produce true beliefs in particular instances. But reliabilism faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify which process is operative in a given case, because any belief is produced by many processes at different levels of generality, and depending on how the process is described, it may be reliable or unreliable. Safety and sensitivity conditions have also been proposed. Safety requires that in nearby possible worlds, where the person still believes the proposition is still true, that the belief could not easily have been false. And sensitivity requires that in nearby worlds, where the proposition is false, the person would not believe it. And these modal conditions attempt to capture the idea that knowledge requires a stable connection between belief and truth, a connection that holds not just in the actual world, but in close counterfactual situations, but both conditions face counterexamples and refinements continue. Virtue epistemology offers another approach, suggesting that knowledge requires belief to be produced by the exercise of intellectual virtues, by cognitive abilities and skills that are credit to the agent. And on this view, Gettier cases fail to be knowledge, because the truth of the belief is not attributable to the cognitive abilities of the believer, but to luck or coincidence. But this raises questions about how to individuate abilities, about what counts as an exercise of skill versus a lucky outcome, and about whether knowledge really requires that the believer deserve credit for getting things right. The debate over Gettier cases has dominated analytic epistemology for over 60 years, generating thousands of papers, dozens of theories, and no clear consensus. And some philosophers have begun to question whether the project of defining knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions is misguided, whether knowledge is a natural kind with sharp boundaries, or whether it is a cluster concept, a family resemblance term that cannot be captured by a precise definition. And experimental philosophers have tested intuitions about Gettier cases across different cultures and demographics, finding some variation and raising questions about whose intuitions should guide philosophical theorizing. Gettier's legacy is immense. His 3-page paper demolished a definition that stood for millennia and launched an industry of epistemological research. And while the original problem, finding necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, remains unsolved, the attempt has deepened our understanding of justification, truth, belief, luck, causation, and the complex relationships between them. And Gettier cases continue to serve as test cases for theories of knowledge, as benchmarks that any adequate theory must handle. And they remind us that even our most basic concepts, even something as central as knowledge itself, are more complex and more elusive than they first appear, that definitions are hard to come by, that counterexamples lurk around every corner, and that the philosophical quest for clarity and precision is never-ending, always encountering new obstacles, new puzzles, new reasons to question what seemed settled. And Smith stands there with his 10 coins, believing truly and with justification that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and yet he does not know. And this simple case, this small story about a job and some coins, contains within it a challenge that philosophy has not yet met, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a gap between justified true belief and knowledge that no fourth condition has successfully closed, and the search continues. Philosophers proposing new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding what knowledge is and what distinguishes it from mere lucky true belief. And Gettier watches from beyond the grave, his 3 pages having accomplished what few philosophical works ever do, fundamentally reshaping the discipline, forcing a rethinking of basic assumptions, proving that even ancient wisdom is vulnerable too. Counterexample, and that the road to philosophical truth is longer and more winding than we imagined. Zeno's dichotomy paradox. To reach a destination, one must first travel half the distance, and before reaching that halfway point, one must first travel half of that. And before reaching that point, one must travel half again. And this process of halving continues infinitely, and so it seems that motion cannot even begin, for there is always another halfway point that must be reached first. And this is Zeno's dichotomy paradox, one of the earliest and most famous arguments against the possibility of motion and change. Imagine a runner who wishes to cross a stadium. Before reaching the far end, they must reach the midpoint. But before reaching the midpoint, they must reach the quarter point. And before that, the 8th point, and so on, dividing the distance into ever smaller intervals without end. And since there are infinitely many such intervals, the runner would have to complete infinitely many tasks. And how can anyone complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time? And yet runners do cross stadiums. People do move from place to place. And so something must be wrong with the argument. But what? Zeno devised this paradox in the 5th century BCE to defend the philosophy of his teacher Parmenides, who claimed that reality is a single, unchanging unity, and that plurality and motion are illusions. And the dichotomy paradox was meant to show that the very concept of motion leads to absurdity, that if space and time can be divided infinitely, then movement becomes impossible, and therefore our perception of motion must be mistaken. Aristotle responded by distinguishing between potential and actual infinity, arguing that while the distance can potentially be divided into infinitely many parts, the runner does not actually traverse each part individually. The runner simply crosses the distance as a continuous whole, and the infinite division is something we can imagine, but not something the runner must perform. The paradox remained troubling for centuries, until the development of calculus in the 17th century by Newton and Leibniz, which provided mathematical tools to handle infinite sums and showed that an infinite series can converge to a finite value, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, and so on adds up to exactly 1. And so the runner crossing infinitely many intervals in finite time is not a contradiction, but a mathematical fact. The sum of the infinite series equals the total distance, and the sum of the corresponding time intervals equals the total time. Yet some philosophers argue that the mathematical solution does not fully dissolve the conceptual problem, that even if the infinite series converges, there is still something mysterious about how an infinite process can be completed, how something that has no end can nevertheless reach an end, and whether the smooth continuous motion we experience is truly composed of infinitely many discrete steps, or whether motion is fundamentally continuous and indivisible. The paradox also raises questions about the structure of space and time, whether they are infinitely divisible, or whether there is a smallest possible unit of distance or duration, a quantum of space or time beyond which further division is meaningless. And modern physics has explored such ideas through quantum mechanics and theories of space-time foam, where the smooth fabric of reality may break down at extremely small scales. Zeno's dichotomy forces confrontation with infinity, with the strange fact that between any 2 points lie infinitely many other points, that the finite contains the infinite, that the continuous emerges from, or perhaps is the discrete, and that motion, the most familiar and undeniable aspect of existence, rests on foundations that are anything but solid. The runner crosses the stadium, the arrow flies, the universe moves and changes, and yet Zeno's voice echoes across the millennia, asking how, asking whether what seems so obvious might be impossible, whether the world we experience is the world that actually is, and whether reason and perception can ever be reconciled when one says motion is real and the other says motion leads to paradox. Bradley's regress, why relations cannot connect anything. A philosopher named F. H. Bradley examines how relations work, examines how objects stand in relations to each other, how one thing is connected to another through relations like larger than, or next to, or causes, and Bradley discovers a problem, a regress that shows relations cannot do the work they are supposed to do, cannot actually connect objects. And the regress goes as follows. Suppose object A is related to object B by relation R, and now ask what connects A to R, what relates the object to the relation, and there must be another relation, call it R prime, that connects A to R, and now what connects A to R prime, there must be another relation R double prime, and the regress continues infinitely. Infinite relations needed to connect A to B through R, and the regress is vicious because each relation requires further relations to do its connecting work, and the connection never grounds, never actually occurs, and so relations do not relate, do not connect objects. And if relations cannot connect, then reality is not structured by relations, is not composed of objects standing in relations. And this is Bradley's regress, an argument against the reality of relations, an argument that shows relations are impossible, are self-defeating, and Bradley concludes that relations are unreal, are appearances rather than genuine features of reality. An ultimate reality is an undifferentiated whole, the absolute, where all apparent multiplicity and relationality dissolve into unity. Imagine two objects, a red ball and a blue ball, and the relation larger than connecting them. The red ball is larger than the blue ball, and ask how this relation connects the balls. How larger than relates the red ball to the blue ball, and there must be something that connects the red ball to the relation larger than, another relation R1, and something that connects R1 to the red ball, another relation R2, and infinite relations are needed, each requiring another relation to connect it, and the larger than relation never actually connects the balls, because the connection requires infinite intermediaries, infinite relations, and the regress shows that positing relations does not explain connection, does not explain how objects stand in relations, only pushes the question back infinitely. Bradley's regress challenges the common sense view that reality consists of objects and relations, challenges the idea that the world has relational structure, that things stand in relations to each other, and if Bradley is right, then relations are impossible, are not genuine features of reality, and the world does not have the structure we think it has, is not composed of separate objects standing in relations, but is somehow unified, is an undifferentiated whole, where separation and relation are illusions generated by thought. And this radical monism, this view that reality is one, follows from taking the regress seriously, from accepting that relations cannot relate and therefore do not exist. Visualize the regress as an infinite chain. A dash R dash B represents A related to B by R, but this structure is unstable, requires further relations R prime and R double prime to connect A to R and R to B. And these further relations require still more relations, and the chain extends infinitely in both directions. And the regress shows that relational structure is impossible, cannot ground, cannot explain how connection occurs, and Bradley uses this to argue for monism, for the view that reality is not many things related but is one thing appearing as many. One response to Bradley's regress denies that relations need relating, denies that the connection between object and relation requires a further relation, argues that relations just do relate, just do connect objects without needing intermediaries. And the regress assumes that relating requires a relation, but this assumption is false. Relations connect objects directly, intrinsically, by their nature, and no further relations are needed. And the regress does not start because the initial premise is rejected, and this response treats relating as primitive, as something relations do without explanation, without needing further entities to make them do it. Another response distinguishes between external and internal relations, argues that some relations are external, contingent, could be otherwise, and these might generate regress, but other relations are internal, necessary, grounded in the intrinsic properties of related objects, and internal relations do not require further relations to connect them because they are not separate entities but are grounded in the objects themselves, and the regress does not apply to internal relations. And while external relations might be problematic, internal relations are sufficient for much relational structure, are sufficient to ground many important connections. A third response appeals to non-relational theories, argues that what appear to be relations are really monadic properties of objects or are reducible to non-relational facts, and larger than is not a genuine relation, but is grounded in the intrinsic sizes of objects. The red ball has size S1, the blue ball has size S2, and S1 exceeds S2, and no relation is needed, no larger than exists independently, and relational facts reduce to non-relational facts about properties, and Bradley's regress is avoided by eliminating relations, replacing them with properties, and this nominalist response preserves structure without positing relations as genuine entities. Bradley's regress also appears in discussions of properties and instantiation, because instantiation is a relation between objects and properties, and the regress applies if object A instantiates property P through instantiation relation I. Then what relates A to I? Another instantiation relation, I prime, and regress ensues, and various solutions have been proposed. Some deny that instantiation is a relation, argue that objects just have properties without needing an instantiation relation to connect them, and others distinguish between types of instantiation, first-order instantiation between objects and properties, and second-order instantiation between instantiation and its relata, and argue that the regress terminates at some level, is not vicious. The regress has influenced debates about the nature of facts and propositions, because facts seem to be structured by relations, seem to involve objects standing in relations, and if relations generate regress, then facts are problematic. And some philosophers have abandoned facts, have argued that reality does not contain structured facts, but only objects and properties, and true propositions do not correspond to facts, but are made true by objects having properties, and Bradley's regress motivates this austere ontology, this rejection of facts, as genuine entities. The red ball sits next to the blue ball, related by spatial proximity, or appearing to be related, and Bradley's regress asks how this relation connects them. How next to does its connecting work? And the answer involves infinite regress, infinite relations, or involves denying that relations are real. And Bradley embraces the denial, accepts monism, accepts that reality is one undifferentiated whole. And modern philosophers mostly reject Bradley's conclusion, reject monism, but the regress remains a challenge, remains a puzzle about how relations work, how connection occurs, and various solutions exist, various ways of blocking the regress, but no consensus emerges. And Bradley's regress endures as a permanent challenge to relational metaphysics, a puzzle showing that the structure of reality, the way objects stand in relations, is more problematic than common sense suggests, and the regress continues, infinite relations chaining backward, and connection remains elusive. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question. Does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. The question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks. And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol. And if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world, and these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot, remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize two systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, and when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these two uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind, like Searle's Chinese Room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensoromotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action. And this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate, and purely symbolic systems can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval, and so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships, and Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, the symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality, and whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. The ship of Theseus. A ship returns to harbour after a long voyage, its wooden planks weathered and damaged by storms and salt, and the repairs begin. One plank is removed and replaced with new wood, then another, and over months or years every single plank, every beam, every nail is replaced until nothing of the original materials remains. And yet it is still called the Ship of Theseus, still registered under the same name, still captained by the same crew, and the question arises, is it the same ship or a different ship? And if it is different, when did it become different? After the first plank was replaced, or the 10th, or the last, and where is the boundary between identity and change? The paradox is ancient, discussed by Greek and Roman philosophers, and it strikes at the heart of what it means for an object to persist through time, to remain itself despite losing and gaining parts. And the problem deepens when a second scenario is introduced. Imagine that all the original planks removed from the ship of Theseus are collected and stored, and then using only those original materials, a second ship is built, an exact replica assembled from the very wood that once formed the ship of Theseus. And now there are two ships, one that has been continuously repaired and one that is made entirely of the original materials. And which one is the true ship of Theseus, the one with continuity of form and function, or the one with continuity of material? The paradox has no clear answer, and different philosophical traditions offer different responses. Some argue that identity is determined by material composition, that an object is the sum of its parts, and so the ship made from original planks is the true ship of Theseus, even though it was disassembled and reassembled, while others argue that identity is determined by form and function, that what makes the ship is its structure and purpose, and so the continuously repaired ship retains its identity, even though none of its original material remains. Still others suggest that identity is conventional, a matter of social agreement and practical convenience, that there is no objective fact about which ship is the real ship of Theseus, only a question of what we choose to call it based on our needs and conventions. The paradox extends beyond ships to living organisms because the cells in the human body are constantly dying and being replaced. And over a period of years, almost every atom in the body is exchanged with the environment. And yet a person is considered the same person throughout their life. And so what makes identity persist? Is it continuity of consciousness, continuity of memory, continuity of physical form, or something else entirely? The problem also appears in legal and ethical contexts. Questions about personal responsibility over time, whether a person who has changed dramatically is still accountable for actions committed decades earlier, whether a corporation that has replaced all its employees and assets is still the same entity bound by old contracts, whether a nation that has undergone revolution and transformation retains the obligations of its former government. Some philosophers embrace a four-dimensionalist view, arguing that objects are not three-dimensional things that persist through time, but four-dimensional space-time worms, extended through time as well as space, and that what we call the ship of Theseus is really a temporally extended object, a continuous path through space-time, and the question of identity becomes a question of how we slice that four-dimensional object into temporal parts. Others reject this view, insisting that objects exist wholly at each moment, that the ship of Theseus at one time is numerically identical to the ship of Theseus at another time, if there is the right kind of continuity between them, though what counts as the right kind of continuity remains disputed. The ship of Theseus paradox remains unsolved, a puzzle that philosophy has examined for over 2 millennia without reaching consensus, and it stands as a reminder that identity, persistence, and change are not as straightforward as they seem, that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is one of the deepest and most difficult in metaphysics, and that the world we navigate, full of objects and people and institutions that seem to endure, may be far more fluid and ambiguous than common sense suggests. The problem of other minds, how you know anyone else, is conscious. You observe a person crying, tears streaming down their face, and you infer that they are sad, that they are experiencing the subjective feeling of sadness, the inner emotional state. And this inference seems natural, seems obvious, but philosopher Bertrand Russell asks what justifies it. What evidence proves that other people have minds, have consciousness, have inner experiences like yours? And the evidence is purely behavioural. You see the tears, hear the words, observe the actions, but you never directly experience another person's consciousness, never feel their pain or see their thoughts. And so the inference from behaviour to consciousness is not logically certain, cannot be proven beyond doubt. And it is logically possible, conceivably, though perhaps not believably, that other people are unconscious automata, zombies who behave as if conscious but have no inner life. And this possibility, however remote, reveals that our knowledge of other minds is inferential. is based on analogy to our own case, and this is the problem of other minds. The epistemological challenge of justifying our belief that other people are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, that they are not merely sophisticated mechanisms producing behavior without accompanying phenomenology. Imagine trying to prove that someone else has consciousness, trying to establish with certainty that they have subjective experiences, and you observe their behavior, see them wince in pain, hear them describe their feelings, watch them respond appropriately to stimuli, and all this behavior is consistent with consciousness, is what we expect conscious beings to do, but it is also consistent with unconsciousness, with sophisticated programming that produces appropriate responses without any inner experience, and there is no test, no observation, no experiment that directly reveals consciousness, that proves beyond doubt that someone else has subjective experiences, and so the inference to other minds is always uncertain, is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. And while we do not actually doubt that other people are conscious, while the skeptical scenario seems absurd, the philosophical point is that our belief cannot be proven, cannot be established with the certainty we might desire. The problem of other minds rests on the asymmetry between first-person and third-person access to mental states. You have direct access to your own consciousness, immediate awareness of your own thoughts and feelings, but you have only indirect access to others' consciousness, can only infer it from their behavior and their reports. And this asymmetry creates an epistemological gap, a gap between what you can know with certainty about yourself and what you can know about others, and crossing this gap requires inference, requires reasoning from observed behavior to unobserved mental states. And such inference is never certain, always vulnerable to error. The traditional solution to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy, which says that I observe a correlation in my own case between mental states and behavior. I know that when I am in pain, I exhibit certain behaviors. When I am sad, I cry, and so on. And I observe that other humans exhibit the same behaviors. And by analogy, I infer that they have the same mental states, that when they exhibit pain behavior, they are in pain. And this analogy is strengthened by the similarity between my body and their bodies, by the fact that we share similar physiology, and so it is reasonable to infer that we share similar mental lives. But critics of the argument from analogy point out that it is based on a sample size of one. On my own case, and generalizing from one case to all cases is weak induction. And moreover, the analogy assumes what it sets out to prove, assumes that behavioral similarity indicates mental similarity, and this assumption is precisely what the skeptic challenges. Visualize the epistemic situation. You are confined to your own consciousness, your own first-person perspective, and everyone else exists outside this perspective, exists as objects in your experience rather than as subjects with their own experiences. And the question is how you know that these objects are also subjects, also have inner lives, and the answer cannot be certain, cannot be proven, can only be inferred with greater or lesser confidence. And this realization that our knowledge of other minds is uncertain is one of the permanent features of the human epistemic situation, a gap that cannot be fully closed. Another approach to the problem of other minds appeals to the best explanation, argues that the hypothesis that other people are conscious, that they have minds, is the best explanation of their behavior, that positing consciousness explains why people speak as they do, why they report experiences, why they act purposefully, and so on. And while the zombie hypothesis, the hypothesis that people lack consciousness, is logically possible, it is not plausible, not the best explanation, and so we are justified in believing that other people are conscious, even though we cannot prove it with certainty. And this response treats knowledge of other minds as a theoretical inference, as a hypothesis confirmed by evidence, rather than a conclusion proven with certainty. A third approach, associated with Wittgenstein, questions the framework of the problem, argues that the idea of privately checking whether another person is conscious is confused, that consciousness is not a hidden inner property that might be present or absent while behavior remains the same, but is manifested in behavior, is constituted by appropriate responsiveness, and there is no gap between behavior and mind. No possibility of zombie-like creatures that behave as if conscious but lack consciousness, because consciousness just is the pattern of appropriate behavior, and the problem of other minds dissolves, because it is based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness is, treats it as an inner object rather than as a pattern of life. The problem of other minds connects to debates about artificial intelligence, about whether machines could be conscious, because the same epistemic situation applies. We observe the behavior of AI systems, see them generate text, respond to questions, exhibit apparently intelligent behavior, and the question arises whether there is consciousness behind the behavior, whether the machine has subjective experiences, or whether it is merely processing symbols without understanding. And our inability to solve the problem of other minds for humans makes the question of machine consciousness even more difficult, even more uncertain, and we face the possibility that we may never know whether AI is conscious, may never be able to prove or disprove machine sentience. The problem also has practical implications for how we treat non-human animals, for whether they have consciousness, feel pain, deserve moral consideration, and our evidence is behavioral. We see animals exhibit pain behavior, avoid harm, seek pleasure, and we infer that they are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, but the inference is uncertain. Is more uncertain the more different the animal is from us, and the problem of other minds makes it difficult to establish definitively which animals are conscious, which can suffer, which deserve protection. You see the person crying, and you believe they are sad, and you comfort them, and the interaction proceeds as if their consciousness is real, as if their suffering matters. And practically, this is enough. Socially, this is how we function. But philosophically, the question remains, how do you know? How can you prove that they are not a sophisticated zombie, that there is really someone home behind the tears? And the answer is that you cannot prove it, can only infer it, can only trust in analogy and explanation, and the shared form of life that suggests consciousness is universal among humans. And the problem of other minds persists, not as a practical obstacle, but as a philosophical recognition of the limits of knowledge, the gap between self and other, between first-person certainty and third-person inference. And the problem endures as a permanent feature of epistemology, a reminder that some things cannot be known with certainty, that consciousness is private, that the inner life of another remains always partially hidden, always known only through the indirect evidence of behavior and report. And the crying continues, and the inference to sadness continues, and life proceeds, and the problem remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a gap that defines the epistemic situation of embodied minds, trying to know other embodied minds, and the question persists, how do you know anyone else is conscious? And the honest answer is, you do not know with certainty. You only believe with confidence but without proof. And this uncertainty is part of what it means to be human, to be a conscious being among what you believe are other conscious beings, but can never know for certain. The Simpsons paradox. A pharmaceutical company tests a new drug, comparing it to an existing treatment, and the study involves two populations, men and women, and when the results are analysed separately by gender, the new drug outperforms the old treatment in both groups. Men who take the new drug recover more frequently than men who take the old treatment, and women who take the new drug also recover more frequently than women who take the old treatment. And so it seems clear that the new drug is superior, effective for both men and women, better than the alternative, and yet when the data from both groups are combined, when the overall recovery rates are calculated across the entire study population, the old treatment appears to outperform the new drug, showing higher overall recovery rates. And this reversal, where a trend that holds in every subgroup, disappears or reverses when the subgroups are combined is Simpson's paradox, named after the statistician Edward Simpson, who described it formally in 1951, though the phenomenon had been noted earlier by others. And the paradox reveals how aggregating data can mislead, how the whole can tell a different story than the parts, and how statistical reasoning requires careful attention to confounding variables and the structure of causal relationships. The resolution of the paradox lies in understanding that the populations are not balanced, that more men than women take the new drug, or more women than men take the old treatment, or that the recovery rates differ between genders for reasons unrelated to the drugs. And this imbalance means that the overall average is dominated by the group with higher representation. And if men have higher recovery rates in general, and most men take the new drug, then the new drug will appear effective overall, even if it is actually less effective than the old treatment when gender is controlled for. Or if the distribution is skewed in other ways, the opposite reversal can occur. And the paradox shows that crude averages can be misleading. That Simpson's paradox occurs whenever there is a lurking variable, a confounding factor that influences both the treatment assignment and the outcome, and failing to account for this variable leads to incorrect conclusions. Consider a simpler example involving college admissions. Suppose a university has two departments, and Department A admits 70% of applicants, while Department B admits 30%. And when applications are examined by gender, it appears that the university discriminates against women, because the overall acceptance rate for women is lower than for men. But when the data are broken down by department, a different picture emerges. In Department A, which is less selective, a higher percentage of female applicants are admitted than male applicants, and in Department B, which is more selective, the same is true. Women are admitted at higher rates than men in both departments, and the overall appearance of discrimination arises because more women apply to Department B, which has a lower acceptance rate, while more men apply to Department A, which has a higher acceptance rate. And so even though women are favoured in both departments, they appear disfavoured overall. And this is Simpson's paradox. The confounding variable is the choice of department, which correlates with both gender and acceptance rate. And ignoring this variable produces a misleading aggregate statistic. The paradox has profound implications for how we interpret statistical data, for medical research where treatment effects can appear or disappear depending on how data are aggregated, for social science where trends in subgroups can reverse when combined, for legal cases where evidence of discrimination or bias can seem to vanish or appear depending on how populations are divided. And the paradox shows that there is no neutral or objective way to report statistics, that the choice of whether to aggregate or disaggregate, whether to control for certain variables or not, is a substantive decision that affects what conclusions can be drawn, and this decision should be guided by causal understanding, by knowledge of which variables are confounders and which are mediators. And this knowledge cannot be derived from the statistics alone, but requires background theory, domain expertise, and careful thinking about causal structure. Simpson's paradox also raises questions about the nature of causation and the relationship between correlation and causation, because the paradox shows that correlations can reverse when additional variables are considered, that associations in data are sensitive to what is held constant and what is allowed to vary, and this means that identifying causal relationships from observational data is more difficult than it might seem, that confounders must be identified and controlled for, that causal inference requires not just statistical analysis but causal modelling, the specification of hypotheses about how variables influence each other. And the paradox is one reason why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for establishing causation, because randomization ensures that treatment assignment is independent of confounding variables, breaking the associations that generate Simpson's paradox. the paradox appears in many real-world contexts. In sports statistics, where a player can have a better batting average than another player in every season, yet a worse average over their entire career, because they played different numbers of games in different seasons. In economic data where wages can increase for every demographic group, yet average wages can decrease overall, because the composition of the workforce shifts toward lower wage groups. In epidemiology, where a treatment can appear harmful overall, yet beneficial in every subgroup, because sicker patients are more likely to receive the treatment, and in each case the paradox reveals the danger of naive data interpretation, the risk of drawing conclusions from aggregate statistics without understanding the underlying structure. Some philosophers and statisticians argue that Simpson's paradox is not really a paradox, but a reminder of the importance of causal thinking, that the appearance of paradox arises only when we treat statistical associations as if they were causal relationships, that once we distinguish between correlation and causation, between conditional independence and causal independence, the paradox dissolves, and the correct answer to whether the new drug is better than the old treatment depends on the causal structure, on whether gender is a confounder that should be controlled for, or a mediator that should not be, and this depends on the mechanisms by which the drugs work and the reasons why gender affects recovery rates. Simpson's paradox has also been used to critique certain statistical practices, to question the use of aggregate statistics in policy making, to highlight the need for transparent reporting of how data are broken down and what variables are controlled for, and to emphasize that statistical analysis is not a neutral technical exercise, but involves interpretive choices that reflect background assumptions and values, and different choices can support different conclusions, even from the same data. And this does not mean that statistics are arbitrary or that all interpretations are equally valid, but it does mean that statistical reasoning requires judgment, requires thinking about causal mechanisms, requires transparency about methods, and requires humility about the limits of what data alone can tell us. The data sit in tables, broken down by subgroups, aggregated across populations, and the numbers tell different stories depending on how they are arranged. And Simpson's paradox reminds us that statistics are not self-interpreting, that averages can mislead, that trends can reverse, and that understanding data requires more than calculation, requires causal reasoning, domain knowledge, and careful attention to structure. And the paradox persists as a warning, a puzzle that appears in textbook examples and real-world disasters, a reminder that numbers lie, or rather that we lie to ourselves when we treat numbers as transparent windows onto reality rather than as constructed representations that must be interpreted with care. And the reversal of trends continues to surprise, continues to catch analysts off guard, continues to generate misleading headlines and faulty policies. And Simpson's paradox endures, not because the mathematics is obscure, but because the temptation to aggregate, to simplify, to collapse complex data into simple averages is overwhelming. And the paradox stands as a permanent challenge to that temptation, a proof that simplification can distort, that the whole is not always the sum of the parts, and that statistical reasoning, done properly, requires vigilance, sophistication, and an understanding of causation that transcends mere correlation. The problem of universals, why redness exists everywhere and nowhere. A philosopher observes that multiple objects share properties. Multiple things are red, multiple objects are round, multiple animals are cats, and this sharing, this commonality, requires explanation, requires understanding what it is for different things to have the same property. And this is the problem of universals, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in metaphysics. The question of whether properties like redness or roundness or cathood are real entities that exist independently of particular objects, are universals that multiple particulars instantiate, or whether properties are merely names, merely words we use to group similar objects without corresponding to any real shared entity. And the problem divides philosophers into realists who accept that universals exist and nominalists who deny them, and both positions face difficulties. Both must explain how we think and talk about properties, how science discovers laws about kinds, how resemblance works, and neither position has one consensus. And the problem of universals remains one of the deepest questions in ontology, a question about the fundamental furniture of reality, about what kinds of things exist. Imagine two red objects, a red ball and a red shirt, and they share something, they are both red, and the question is what this sharing amounts to, what grounds the similarity. And the realist says both objects instantiate the same universal, the property redness, which exists as a separate entity, an abstract object that is somehow present in both particulars. And the universal redness is one thing that exists in multiple places, is wholly present in each red object. And this explains similarity, explains how multiple things can be red. They all instantiate the same universal, and the nominalist says there is no universal. There are only the particular red objects, and the similarity is primitive, is a brute fact, or is explained by resemblance. The objects resemble each other, or is explained by linguistic convention. We call both red using the same word, and redness is not a real entity, but is a feature of our language or conceptual scheme. The problem can be stated as a dilemma. Either properties are universals, abstract entities that exist independently of particulars, or properties are just features of particulars. And if properties are universals, then we face the problem of how abstract entities relate to concrete particulars, how universals are present in objects, whether they exist in Plato's realm of forms separate from physical reality, or exist in objects themselves, as Aristotle thought. And if properties are just features of particulars, then we face the problem of explaining resemblance, explaining what makes multiple objects similar, what grounds classification into kinds, and neither horn is comfortable. Neither provides an obvious easy answer. And the problem of universals forces us to choose between problematic metaphysics or problematic nominalism. Visualize the realist picture, a realm of abstract universals, redness, roundness, cathood, existing eternally and independently, and particular objects participating in these universals, instantiating them, exemplifying them, and an object is read by standing in an instantiation relation to the universal redness. And this relation is mysterious, is not itself explained. How do abstract universals connect to concrete particulars? How does the abstract realm interact with the physical realm? And the realist must either accept this as primitive, as an unexplained connection, or provide a theory of instantiation. And various theories have been proposed, but all face difficulties, all struggle to explain how universals and particulars relate. One version of realism, Platonic realism, says universals exist in a separate realm, a realm of forms, and particulars participate in forms, and the perfect circle exists in the realm of forms, and physical circles approximate it, participate in it imperfectly. And this explains how we can think about perfect circles. Even though no physical object is perfectly circular, we grasp the form directly through reason, but the theory faces the problem of how we access the realm of forms, how our minds, which are physical, can connect to abstract entities, and the theory faces the problem of how participation works, how forms relate to particulars. And Aristotle rejected Platonic realism, argued that forms exist in particulars, are immanent in objects, not transcendent, and redness exists in red objects, is a component of them, and this avoids the separate realm, but creates other problems. How can one form be in many places? How can universals be divided among particulars? Nominalism rejects universals entirely, accepts only particulars, and explains similarity without appealing to shared properties. And various nominalist strategies exist. Resemblance nominalism says objects are similar because they resemble each other. and resemblance is primitive, not explained by shared properties, and redness is just the class of objects that resemble paradigm red objects. And this avoids commitment to universals but faces the problem that resemblance seems to presuppose properties, seems to require that objects share something. And if resemblance is primitive, then we have not really eliminated properties but renamed them. And resemblance nominalism faces technical difficulties with explaining degrees of resemblance, with avoiding circularity. Another nominalist approach, predicate nominalism, says properties are just predicates, just words, and redness is the predicate red, and objects are red by satisfying the predicate. And this linguistic nominalism faces the problem of explaining why predicates apply. What makes it true that an object satisfies red? And the answer seems to require properties after all, seems to presuppose that objects have features that make predicates apply, and so predicate nominalism seems to presuppose what it denies, seems to need properties to explain predication. A third nominalist approach, trope theory, accepts that properties exist but denies that they are universals, argues that properties are particulars, are individual instances, and each red object has its own individual redness, its own red trope, and tropes resemble each other. Explains similarity, and universals are eliminated, replaced by classes of resembling tropes, and this approach preserves some realist insights, accepts that properties are real, while avoiding commitment to abstract universals, and trope theory has been developed extensively, has become a major alternative to both traditional realism and nominalism, and provides a middle ground that many find attractive. The problem of universals also affects science, affects understanding what scientific laws are, because laws concern kinds, concern all electrons or all mammals, and laws seem to involve universals, seem to say that all objects instantiating a certain universal behave in certain ways, and if universals do not exist, then what are laws about? Are they merely regularities in particular objects? Are they conventions of our theorizing? And nominalists must explain how science discovers objective laws if kinds are not real, if universals do not exist. And this challenge drives some philosophers toward realism, toward accepting that kinds are real, that universals exist because science seems to require them. The red ball and red shirt share something or do not share anything, are similar by instantiating a universal or by resembling each other. And the problem of universals asks which, asks what properties are, whether they are real entities or linguistic conveniences, whether redness exists in Plato's heaven or in particular red things, or only in our conceptual scheme. And the answers divide philosophers, have divided them for millennia. And the problem remains unsolved, remains central to metaphysics, and redness exists everywhere in all red things. If realism is true, and nowhere if nominalism is true, and the problem persists, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology, a question about whether reality contains abstract repeatable entities, or only concrete unrepeatable particulars, and the universals wait, existing or not existing, and the problem endures. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real, and this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have two incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason, that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments. And Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties. And Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle. And so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios. That knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigate between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, while the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. The problem of the one, why nothing can be truly unified. A philosopher asks the opposite question, not why there are many where we expect one, but why there is one where we observe many, asks how parts compose wholes, how multiplicity becomes unity, how many things can constitute one thing, and this is the problem of the one, the puzzle about unity, about what makes a collection of parts into a genuine single object rather than merely a plurality. And the problem is ancient, goes back to Greek philosophy, to debates about whether wholes are real or are merely conceptual constructions from parts. And the puzzle is that unity seems to require something beyond mere collection, requires a principle of unity that binds parts together. But what could this principle be? What makes a collection of atoms a person, rather than merely atoms arranged person-wise? What makes a ship, rather than merely planks fastened together? And if unity is not explained by parts alone, then what explains it? And if unity is just conceptual, just imposed by our minds, then objects are not real, are not mind-independent, and reality consists only of parts, of fundamental particles, and all composition is conventional. And this threatens ordinary ontology, threatens the reality of familiar objects. And this is the problem of the one, the challenge to explain how genuine unity arises from multiplicity, how the one emerges from the many. Imagine a statue, a bronze sculpture of a human figure, and ask what the statue is, and one answer says the statue is a collection of bronze atoms arranged statue-wise. The atoms are parts and the statue is the whole. They compose. But what makes this collection a statue rather than merely atoms? What unifies the atoms into one object? And the answer cannot be just spatial proximity, because atoms separated by empty space are still separate, not unified. And the answer cannot be just causal interaction, because atoms in different objects interact causally, through electromagnetic forces, without composing a single object. And the answer seems to require something additional. A principle of unity, a form in Aristotelian terms, or a substance in Cartesian terms, something that binds parts into wholes. But this additional element is mysterious, is not itself a physical part, and positing it seems like mysterious ontology, and avoiding it seems to require denying that wholes exist, accepting mereological nihilism, the view that only simples exist, only fundamental particles, and composition never occurs, and all talk of composite objects is loose speaking, is convenient fiction. The problem of the one connects to debates about composition, about when parts compose wholes, about what conditions must be met for composition to occur, and the problem is that every proposed answer seems either too permissive, allows too many compositions, allows arbitrary collections to count as objects, or too restrictive, disallows too many compositions, eliminates familiar objects, and finding the right balance, the correct answer to when composition occurs, has proven impossible. And Peter van Inwagen argued that this impossibility suggests composition rarely occurs, perhaps only when parts constitute living organisms, and ordinary inanimate objects do not exist, are not genuine wholes, are only simples arranged object-wise. And this revisionary ontology preserves unity for organisms, but eliminates most ordinary objects. And critics find this too extreme, too counterintuitive, too willing to deny the obvious existence of chairs and tables and planets. Visualize unity as a relation between parts that binds them into wholes. And the question is, what grounds this relation? What makes it obtain? And if the relation is fundamental, not reducible to other facts about parts, then we have expanded our ontology, have added relations to our list of basic entities. And if the relation is reducible, is just parts having certain properties, or standing in certain spatial or causal relations, then we can eliminate talk of wholes, can replace it with talk of parts and their relations, and the whole is not an additional entity but is just the parts and relations described collectively. And this eliminativist approach solves the problem of the one by denying that unified wholes exist, accepting that only parts exist and unity is conceptual, is our way of organizing parts into groups. And objects are not discovered but constructed by our practices of grouping and naming. One response to the problem of the one embraces mereological universalism, argues that any parts whatsoever compose a whole, that composition always occurs, that for any collection of objects, no matter how disparate, there is a further object that they compose. And this position accepts vast ontology, accepts that there are objects, like the fusion of your left hand and the Eiffel Tower, bizarre, scattered objects that common sense would reject. And the advantage is that composition is simple, unrestricted, explained by a single principle. But the disadvantage is that most composite objects are not recognized by ordinary thought, are not natural kinds, are arbitrary fusions, and this threatens to make ontology too easy, too unconstrained, accepts too much rather than too little. Another response accepts that some compositions occur and others do not, that there are principal distinctions, that organisms compose wholes but arbitrary collections do not, that bonding or causation or functional integration grounds composition determines when parts unify into wholes, and this moderate position preserves ordinary objects, accepts that chairs and organisms exist while rejecting bizarre fusions. And the challenge is to state the principle precisely, to say exactly which compositions occur, and every proposed principle faces counterexamples. faces cases where intuition says composition occurs, but the principle says it does not, or vice versa, and no principle has won consensus, and the problem of the one persists as a challenge to find the correct theory of composition. A third response questions whether the problem has a solution, argues that composition is vague, is indeterminate, that there are cases where there is no fact of the matter whether composition occurs, where the boundary between unified whole and mere collection is fuzzy. And this response treats the problem of the one as showing that reality is indeterminate in certain respects, that not all questions about existence have determinate answers, and some philosophers embrace this, accept vague existence, while others reject it as incoherent, as violating the law of excluded middle, and the debate continues. The problem of the one also affects our understanding of ourselves, of persons, because persons seem to be unified wholes, seem to be single subjects of experience, despite being composed of many cells, many organs, many subsystems. And what unifies a person? What makes a collection of cells? One person rather than many cells. And the answer cannot be just physical contiguity, because persons survive cell replacement, survive gradual change in material composition, and the answer seems to require psychological continuity, sameness of consciousness, unity of perspective. But these are not physical properties, are not features of cells, and so persons might not be physical objects, might be non-physical entities that somehow relate to bodies, and this threatens materialism, threatens the view that persons are nothing over and above their physical parts. And the problem of the one for persons remains unsolved, remains a challenge for theories of personal identity. The statue stands, one or many, unified or merely assembled, and the person exists, one subject or many cells, and the problem of the one persists, asking how unity arises, how the many become one, how parts compose wholes, and no answer fully satisfies. No theory explains unity without mystery, without positing irreducible relations or denying obvious unities, and the problem endures as a central puzzle in metaphysics, a challenge to explain what we take for granted, that objects are singular, are unified, are more than mere heaps of parts, and perhaps unity is primitive, is inexplicable, is something we must accept without analysis, or perhaps unity is illusory, is imposed by mind on parts that remain forever separate, and the problem remains, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology. The liberal paradox, when freedom and choice destroy each other. An economist named Amartya Sen constructs a paradox about individual liberty and social choice, about whether societies can simultaneously respect individual freedom and satisfy basic welfare criteria. And the paradox goes as follows. Suppose society values individual freedom, values the principle that each person should be decisive over certain personal matters, should have sovereignty over a domain of choices, perhaps what to wear or what to read or how to live, and call this principle minimal liberalism. The requirement that each individual has at least one pair of alternatives where their preference determines social choice. And now suppose society also values Pareto efficiency, values the principle that if everyone prefers outcome A to outcome B, then society should choose A, should not choose an outcome that makes everyone worse off. And Sen proves that these two principles are incompatible, that no social decision procedure can guarantee both minimal liberalism and Pareto efficiency, that respecting individual freedom can conflict with respecting unanimous preferences. And this is the liberal paradox, also called the impossibility of a Paretian liberal, a demonstration that liberal values contain internal tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that respecting individual choice over personal matters can lead to outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And the paradox has generated enormous literature, has sparked debates about the nature of rights, about whether rights are absolute or can be traded, about how to resolve conflicts between liberty and welfare, and the liberal paradox remains one of the most important results in social choice theory, remains a challenge to liberal political philosophy. Imagine a specific example. Two people, call them Prude and Lude, and a book, and Prude prefers that no one read the book, finds it offensive, would be most satisfied if neither reads it. And second best for Prude is if Prude reads it rather than Lude reading it, because at least then Prude can argue against it from first-hand knowledge, and worst for Prude is if Lude reads it while Prude does not. And Lude has opposite preferences, most prefers that Prude read the book, because Lude thinks Prude needs liberalising. Second best for Lude is that Lude reads it, and worst is that neither reads it. And now apply minimal liberalism. Say that Prude should be decisive over whether Prude reads the book, should have the right to choose for themselves, and Lude should be decisive over whether Lude reads the book, and Prude chooses not to read, exercises their right, and Lude chooses to read, exercises their right, and the outcome is Prude does not read and Lude reads, but both prefer the outcome where Prude reads and Lude does not. Both rank that outcome higher, and so the liberal outcome, the outcome that respects individual rights, violates Pareto efficiency, produces an outcome that both prefer to avoid, and the paradox emerges, respecting rights produces an outcome that unanimous preferences reject. The liberal paradox demonstrates that rights and welfare can conflict, that giving individuals control over personal matters can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And this challenges the assumption that liberalism is coherent, that respecting freedom always improves welfare, and Sen's paradox shows that this is false, shows that freedom and welfare can diverge, that societies face trade-offs between respecting rights and respecting preferences, and different resolutions prioritize differently. Some prioritize rights and accept that Pareto improvements may be blocked, accept that unanimous preferences may be overridden by individual sovereignty, and other resolutions prioritize welfare and accept that rights may be violated when everyone would benefit, and neither resolution is fully satisfying. Both involve accepting tensions within liberal values. Visualize the paradox as revealing a cycle. Individual rights produce an outcome, unanimous preferences reject that outcome and prefer an alternative, but that alternative violates individual rights, and we are stuck cannot satisfy both rights and preferences simultaneously. And this cycle shows that liberalism contains contradictions, that its commitments can conflict, and resolving the conflict requires prioritizing, requires deciding whether rights or welfare is more fundamental, and different liberal theories answer differently. Rights-based liberalism prioritizes rights and accepts welfare losses. Welfare-based liberalism prioritizes welfare and accepts rights violations, and no theory satisfies both perfectly. One response to the liberal paradox argues that the problem is with the specification of rights, that the rights in Sen's example are meddlesome, are concerned with what others do, and proper rights are self-regarding, are concerned only with what you do, not with what others do. And if rights are limited to self-regarding matters, then the paradox may not arise, then respecting rights may be compatible with Pareto efficiency. And this response requires distinguishing between self-regarding and other regarding preferences, between preferences about your own life and preferences about others' lives. And liberalism protects the former, but not the latter, and this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of rights, by denying that Prude has a right to prevent Lude from reading, even if Prude prefers that outcome. Another response accepts the paradox, accepts that rights sometimes block Pareto improvements, and argues that this is acceptable, that rights are constraints on social choice, are not mere preferences to be aggregated, but are protections that cannot be violated even for welfare gains. And this deontological response treats rights as absolute, as trumps over welfare, and accepts that respecting rights may produce outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And this response is consistent with rights-based liberalism, with the view that individual freedom is foundational, is not negotiable, and welfare considerations cannot override rights. And the paradox is accepted as showing the cost of rights, showing that freedom has trade-offs. A third response questions the Pareto principle, argues that unanimous preferences should not always be respected, that preference satisfaction is not always good. And in Sen's example, the preferences are meddlesome, are concerned with interfering in others' choices, and perhaps such preferences should not count, should not be given weight in social choice. And this response modifies the Pareto principle to exclude meddlesome preferences, to respect only preferences about self-regarding matters. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of preferences that matter for social choice. And this approach has some support, has intuitive appeal, because it seems wrong to let people's preferences about others' private behaviour determine social outcomes, seems to give too much weight to intolerance or judgment. The liberal paradox also connects to debates about paternalism, about whether societies should prevent people from making choices that harm themselves, and paternalism violates minimal liberalism, overrides individual choice for welfare reasons, and the paradox shows why such overriding might be tempting, shows that respecting choice can produce outcomes that the chooser prefers to avoid. And this creates pressure toward paternalism, toward intervention, but liberalism resists, maintains that individual choice must be respected even when it leads to regret. And the tension between respecting choice and promoting welfare is permanent, is built into liberal theory, and the paradox makes it explicit. Some argue that the liberal paradox is merely theoretical, is unlikely in practice, requires specific preference structures that rarely occur, and empirical investigation of whether such structures exist would be valuable, but regardless of frequency, the paradox is important as a logical possibility, as a demonstration that liberal principles can conflict. And this shows that liberalism requires trade-offs, requires balancing competing values, and political philosophy must grapple with these trade-offs rather than assuming that liberal values are always compatible. The paradox also raises questions about whether societies should recognize rights at all, whether individual sovereignty over personal matters is justified if it can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And consequentialists might use the paradox to argue against rights, to argue that social choice should be based on welfare alone, without constraints from individual rights. But most find this conclusion extreme, find that rights are valuable despite potential conflicts with welfare, and the challenge is to specify rights carefully, to balance rights and welfare, to create institutions that respect both as much as possible while recognizing that perfect compatibility is impossible. Prude and Lude exercise their rights, make their choices, and the outcome satisfies liberal principles but violates Pareto efficiency, and both prefer an alternative, but that alternative requires violating someone's rights, requires overriding someone's choice, and the paradox stands unresolved, showing that liberalism contains tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that rights and preferences can diverge, and the liberal paradox endures as one of the important impossibility results in social choice theory, as a challenge to liberal political philosophy, as a demonstration that liberal values are not perfectly compatible. And the paradox remains a permanent feature of liberal theory, requiring careful navigation, requiring trade-offs between competing values, and showing that coherent liberalism is more complex than it appears. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, And all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice. And yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free. Are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain? And the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Pereboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories. Forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Pereboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic inheritance and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Pereboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization. And this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility. And the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design. And the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control, and whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The free rider problem: why nobody pays for what everyone wants. A community needs a public good, needs streetlights perhaps, or clean air or national defence, and this good has a special property. It is non-excludable. Once provided, it is available to everyone, regardless of whether they contributed to its provision, and it is non-rivalrous. One person's use does not reduce availability for others. And these properties create a problem, create incentives for free riding, for enjoying the benefits without bearing the costs, and each individual reasons that their contribution is small, is negligible, will not determine whether the good is provided, and so they can free ride, can enjoy the streetlights, whether they pay or not. And since paying is costly, and the good will be provided or not, regardless of their individual contribution, it is individually rational to free ride. And if everyone reasons this way, then no one contributes. The good is not provided, and everyone is worse off than if everyone had contributed. And this is the free rider problem, a fundamental challenge in public economics, a demonstration that voluntary provision of public goods is difficult, tends toward underprovision, and solving the problem requires mechanisms that make contribution individually rational, requires collective action, requires institutions that enable groups to provide goods that individuals cannot or will not provide voluntarily. And the free rider problem explains why governments exist, why taxation is necessary, why voluntary charity is insufficient for providing public goods. And the problem remains central to political philosophy, to debates about the role of government, to questions about when collective coercion is justified. Imagine a neighbourhood deciding whether to install streetlights, and the lights would benefit everyone, would make the streets safer, would be valued by all residents. And suppose the lights cost $100 per household, and each household values the lights at $150. So collectively, the benefit exceeds the cost. Provision is efficient, but each household faces a decision: contribute or free ride. And the calculation is straightforward. If enough others contribute, the lights will be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $50. But if I free ride, I pay nothing and still get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $150. So I am better off free riding, and if not enough others contribute, then the lights will not be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get nothing because the lights are not installed. And if I free ride, I pay nothing and get nothing. So I am no worse off free riding, and in both cases, free riding dominates contributing. And since every household reasons this way, no one contributes, the lights are not installed, and everyone loses the net benefit they could have had. And this is the free rider problem. The free rider problem demonstrates that individual rationality can lead to collective inefficiency, that goods which everyone wants can fail to be provided because no individual has incentive to contribute, and the problem is structural, is inherent in the properties of public goods, and cannot be solved by appealing to altruism or social responsibility, because even small amounts of altruism are insufficient, because as long as some people free ride, the burden on contributors increases, and this creates resentment, undermines cooperation, and voluntary provision tends to fail. And the solution typically involves coercion, involves mandatory contributions through taxation, and governments exist partly to solve free rider problems, to provide public goods through collective funding, and taxation is justified on the grounds that it enables provision of goods that voluntary contribution cannot reliably provide. Visualize the free rider problem as a threshold public good, where the good is provided only if total contributions exceed some threshold, and individuals must decide whether to contribute without knowing whether others will contribute, and the dominant strategy is to free ride because your contribution is costly and makes little difference to whether the threshold is met, and everyone free rides. The threshold is not met. The good is not provided, and this shows why voluntary provision fails, why collective action problems arise, why coordination on contribution is difficult without institutional mechanisms. And solving the problem requires commitment devices, requires mechanisms that ensure contributions are made, that prevent free riding, and taxation is one such mechanism, makes contribution mandatory, eliminates the free riding option, and enables provision of public goods that markets fail to provide. One response to the free rider problem is Lindahl taxation, a theoretical solution where each individual pays according to their marginal benefit from the public good, pays their willingness to pay, and this makes contribution individually rational because you pay only what the good is worth to you. But Lindahl taxation faces practical problems, requires knowing each person's valuation, which people have incentive to misrepresent, have incentive to understate to reduce their tax burden, and the mechanism is not incentive compatible, is vulnerable to strategic behaviour, and cannot be implemented in practice. And so while Lindahl taxation is theoretically optimal, it does not solve the real-world free rider problem. Another response is assurance contracts, where contributions are collected conditionally, are returned if the threshold is not met. And this solves one problem with voluntary provision, eliminates the risk of contributing without the good being provided. But assurance contracts do not eliminate free riding incentive, do not make contributing dominant, because you still benefit from the good whether you contribute or not. And so assurance contracts help but do not fully solve the problem, and empirical evidence shows that contribution rates improve with assurance contracts but remain below optimal levels. A third response is social sanctions, where free riders are punished through social disapproval, through reputation loss, through exclusion from other cooperative activities, and social sanctions can support contribution in small groups where behaviour is observable, where reputation matters, where repeated interaction creates incentives for cooperation, and community provision of public goods often relies on social sanctions, relies on norms that support contribution and punish free riding. And these mechanisms can be effective in tight-knit communities but are less effective in large anonymous societies where behaviour is hard to observe and reputation effects are weak. The free rider problem also appears in debates about international cooperation, about providing global public goods like climate stability, pandemic prevention, biodiversity preservation, and these goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous at global scale, and nations face free rider incentives, benefit from the good whether they contribute or not. And this makes international cooperation difficult, makes agreements fragile, and nations have incentive to free ride, to benefit from others' contributions while minimizing their own. And solving global free rider problems requires international institutions, requires mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement, requires ways to make contribution individually rational for nations. And the difficulty of achieving such cooperation explains why global public goods are underprovided, why climate change proceeds despite universal acknowledgement of its dangers, why pandemic preparedness is inadequate despite obvious benefits. The problem also raises philosophical questions about political obligation, about whether citizens have duties to support public goods, whether taxation is legitimate coercion or justified contribution, and libertarians argue that taxation for public goods is problematic, violates individual rights, and anarcho-capitalists argue that even genuine public goods should be provided voluntarily or not at all, while social democrats argue that taxation is justified to solve collective action problems, is necessary for provision of goods that voluntary mechanisms cannot reliably provide, and the debate turns on whether the free rider problem justifies coercion, whether preventing free riding is sufficient reason to impose mandatory contributions, and different political philosophies answer differently. Some argue that the free rider problem is overstated, that voluntary provision is more successful than theory predicts, that people do contribute to public goods despite free rider incentives. And empirical evidence supports this, shows that people do contribute voluntarily to charities, to public radio, to open source software, and contribution rates exceed zero even when free riding is possible. And this suggests that people are not purely self-interested, have preferences for fairness, for contributing to collective goods, for avoiding being seen as free riders, and behavioral economics explains these patterns through social preferences, through conditional cooperation, through warm glow effects from giving, and while voluntary provision remains below optimal levels, it is not zero, and this shows that humans are more cooperative than pure economic theory predicts. But it does not eliminate the free rider problem, does not make voluntary provision reliably sufficient, and government provision remains necessary for most public goods. The streetlights remain dark, the clean air remains polluted, the defence remains unprovided, and everyone wishes for the public good, but no one contributes. Everyone free rides, everyone waits for others to pay, and the good is not provided, and the free rider problem persists as one of the fundamental challenges in political economy, remains a justification for government, remains a reason why taxation exists, why collective provision is necessary, and the problem shows that markets fail for public goods, that voluntary mechanisms are insufficient, that individual rationality leads to collective inefficiency, and solving the problem requires institutions, requires mechanisms that make contribution mandatory or that change incentives to make contribution rational, and without such mechanisms, public goods are underprovided. Remain goods that everyone wants but nobody provides, and the free rider problem endures.